Thank you. And if we could just get a copy, that'd be great. Okay. I guess we'll go ahead and start. Welcome to the public open house for Ridgeway. And we want to talk about information, the flood risk study information for the town. And appreciate your taking time to meet with us tonight. Next slide, please. So introductions, we have the town of Ridgeway. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves, please?
Preston Neal, Ridgeway Town Manager. John Clark, Ridgeway Mayor.
Thank you. And I'm Terry Fade. I'm the floodplain mapping program manager for the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and we've been heading up this study as well as other similar studies across the state. So don't know if Marta's on yet, but go ahead. And Michael, CDM Smith is the engineer on this project. So Mike, you want to go ahead?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Schultz. I'm a GIS specialist with CDM Smith, and I have worked on the mapping for Ouray County.
And then FEMA is our federal sponsor, and they're funding this project. So Christine and Aaron, I'll let you guys go ahead.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Chris Gaines. I'm with FEMA Region 8, and I'm the mapping lead for the state of Colorado. Aaron?
Thank you, Christine. I'm Erin May. I'm the NFIP Flood Insurance Regional Liaison, so I can address any insurance-related questions and help you guys with your concerns in that department.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So we're going to have a little bit of an National Flood Insurance Program recap. It's a program by the federal government, and it has four main pillars or four main legs to a particular stool for supporting the program. And that is the flood risk identification, which is the flood risk mapping that we're doing to identify flood hazard. There's flood insurance that helps people with quicker recovery if a flood disaster happens, and it helps offset the damage. Then there's managing the floodplains to minimize future risk and promote safety. Then mitigation grants to assist in the reduction of existing risk and also to protect lives and property. The program is a voluntary program. It's managed by the federal government, by FEMA, and the communities, it's overseen by FEMA. The communities manage the program, and lenders enforce the mandatory flood insurance purchase. If homes are within the 100-year floodplain or the 1% annual chance floodplain, there's a mandatory flood insurance purchase. And sometimes lenders will also require flood insurance just if your property's in the floodplain, but lenders are the ones that actually enforce that regulation. And then the risk is determined through engineering analysis. So based on scientific data and technology, that's the latest technology that's used, and it's all done to FEMA standards. And then communities participate, and participating communities, any of the residents within the community have federal flood insurance made available. So whether you're in the floodplain or not, federal flood insurance is available as long as your community is participating, which the town of Ridgeway is, as well as Ouray County. And this also will help with any updated flood risk that you guys have in the future, because right now the maps are 1985 and not digital. And this will serve as a basis for you guys it'll make it easier to keep things updated and as they change going forward. So that'll be a plus as well. Can you, next slide, please. So the risk map program is a program within the National Flood Insurance Program. And it's kind of a holistic approach to flood hazard and flood risk. By mapping and identifying the risk, we do the flood hazard identification. We use different risk assessment tools to assess risk in areas. And then we help with the planning, with the community mitigation plans and actions, so that we not only provide you with the information, but we try to help communities move forward with whatever kind of mitigation actions are available. And that often is funded with the mitigation grants that FEMA provides. The risk map projects are based on FEMA guidelines, and it's the best available data and technology at the time. So it aligns with other risk and mitigation projects. So it information is able to be leveraged for some of those other programs as well. FEMA also provides non-regulatory products, which are basically a little easier sometimes to convey the risk. It's water surface elevation grids, so you can click on a particular location and see what the water surface elevation is for the 1% annual chance flood or the 100-year flood. And then it also has depth grids. You can see how deep water is in different places. And also there could be velocity grids that help you see how fast the water is moving. So you can kind of see what kind of hazard you are subject to at any given point in the floodplain mapping, which is really helpful and sometimes helps especially convey sense of risk to community members. So it also is good for using for future planning and mitigation of the flood risks. Next slide, please. So Michael, take it over.
Thank you, Derek. So the preliminary maps we generated and sent out back in February follow the modern formats, quite a bit of improvement over the old 1985 maps. These maps are in color for one, have an aerial background for two, so quite a bit more user friendly. Now these are available in both paper, which we have some in the back if you're interested in looking through them when we're done here, you're more than welcome to. And they're also available in digital format, and a few slides in I'll have some email or website addresses where you can download those. Next slide. Okay, from a homeowner's perspective, this is kind of an important slide here. So what are we looking at? So basically, the 1% annual chance flood, also known as the 100-year flood, is represented in blue. And this is the area that has a 1% chance in any given year of being inundated. The 0.2% annual chance flood is also known as the 500-year flood. So it has a 0.2% chance in any given year of being inundated. And the floodway is kind of the core of the channel where it conveys most of the flow. This is quite a bit more tightly regulated, and that's represented with the red and the blue hatches there. So any development there would be some pretty strict regulations on what could be done there. But this is kind of the basic zones that we could expect to see on any flood insurance rate. Now, the 100-year flood is also known as the SFHA, it's a special flood hazard area. It's lots of acronyms with this stuff. That's one to remember. So if you're in the SFHA, you're in the 100-year flood zone. And if you see a flood zone, if it has an A in front of it, whether it's just A, AE, AO, AH, anything with an A, you're in the 100-year flood zone. So just as something to remember, because there's a lot of different types. But if it's got an A, you're in the 100-year. Next slide, please. So there's a timeline of the project. So today we're at the CCO and public meetings. It's the second blue bar in. So up next is the appeal and comment process. So this is the requirement for due process for these projects. That period lasts about 90 days. At this point, it's kind of hard to estimate exactly when that 90-day window will be, but our best guess at this point is sometime during the fall. If we receive any appeals or comments, we'll work to resolve them, and then we'll move on to final mapping, which culminates with the letter of final determination, the LFD, which basically kicks off the map adoption period for the communities, at which point they adopt them into their ordinances. And 6 months the day after the LFD, the maps become effective. So best guess at this time would be later in 2023. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is where you can get some of this data. The FEMA Map Service Center, msc.fema.gov is the official repository. They have all the preliminary maps. They have all the effective maps. They have historic maps if there's any applicable to this area. They have all the LOMAs and LOMARs. It's a letter of map amendment and letter of map revision. So basically any data effective, preliminary, or historic is available for download directly from FEMA. Next slide. Additionally, for some additional information, you can go to coloradohazardmapping.com. Now, this has the same data available for download, plus some of the intermediate data used to develop these maps, things like topo and survey and stuff like that. But what's particularly useful, I think, from a homeowner perspective, is the web map here, where you can punch in your address, it'll take you to that location, you can see if you're in the flood zone. Now, I believe that's done at the parcel level, to my knowledge, so it may not necessarily identify your house or your structure, but it gets you pretty close, and then you can turn on the aerial background and kind of see where you fall in the grand scheme of things. So those, for at this point, I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Aaron to talk about awareness of insurance.
Okay, so this is kind of an interesting slide because I always struggle with this 26% chance. So if you, as you guys are reading across the top, it says you have a 26 chance if you're in a high risk flood zone of having a claim over, can you go back one slide? Over a lifetime of a 30-year mortgage. So I kind of like 1 in 4 for that reason, because I think it's more significant. So if there's 4 of you sitting in that room, and you're all in the high risk flood zone, 1 of you statistically over your 30-year mortgage, it's going to have a claim. So that, you know, I think that hits home. You know, there's some other fun statistics there. Odds of losing your teeth. Who thought of putting that one in there? Come on, guys. That's just
Not fair.
Anyway, okay, next slide. All right, let's talk a little bit about the benefits of flood insurance versus disaster assistance. So, you know, time and again, when I talk to people after a disaster, they'll say, well, I always just thought FEMA would come in and you know, and help me. And disaster assistance is given out if there is a presidential declaration, but there's some standards that those have to meet for an individual building owner to qualify, and the state has to run those numbers. And a lot of times in Colorado, we don't meet that requirement. And if I'm not mistaken, we met that requirement back in 2013 when we had catastrophic flooding across the entire state. But before then, it had been since 1985 that we required or that we qualified for individual assistance for flooding in Colorado, 85, 86, somewhere in there. And so we have to meet a pretty big standard. Now, your local community may receive dollars to rebuild infrastructure in your communities. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you as an individual are going to receive monies. It has to be a pretty big event. So the advantage of insurance is obviously you don't have to wait for that presidential declaration in order to qualify and recover. And, you know, from a community perspective, you know, it helps the community recover as well. The more properties that are insured, people are way more likely to recover and move on with their life if they have flood insurance than if they don't. And so that helps the community overall not have that blight following a disaster event. And then the second bullet, I think, is the most important bullet on here, is that we are seeing dramatic increases in our claims. When I first started with the program 13 years ago, we would say more than 20% of our claims were from properties that were in low to moderate risk flood zones. And now that number is 35%. And that was actually, our numbers were a little higher in that 2013 event than 35%. We had claims for people who were in low to moderate risk flood zones. It was somewhere between more like anywhere from 35 to 45%. We had trouble pulling those numbers out. The reporting tools weren't that great back then. They're much better now. And then it reimburses you for all of your building losses up to $250,000. The disaster assistance, the maximum that you're going to get is $35,000, and any remaining assistance you might receive is in the form of a loan. And then most importantly, you're most likely or could be required to carry flood insurance on top of that disaster assistance. So you avoid all those problems on all the qualification needs that have to be met on the right if you have your own flood insurance. And as we all know, you know, your home for most people is the biggest investment they make in their lives. And so protecting it is important. Let's go to the next slide. What's new in risk rating, in our risk rating methodology? We've dramatically changed the way we rate. We're sort of bringing our rating tools into the 21st century. One of the things that is changing is that we used to have a one rate for people who are in a high risk flood zone, and here in Colorado, that's any A zone. And then a much lower rate for people who are in lower to moderate risk flood zone called the preferred risk policy. And this new rating methodology takes into account a lot of data. And the first thing that changes is that we're basing it on a number of variables, one of which is the distance from the water source. So everyone now is going to be based on the distance of a water source. It really wasn't fair in the past that somebody in an A zone next door to somebody who was in a low to moderate risk flood zone saw this dramatic difference in rates. So now that's all going to be based on that distance in the water source. And the bottom two links there take you out to some of the data that we've provided on this. And also those state profiles are kind of interesting. You can actually dig down by zip code and see how those, how those rates are going to change in your zip code. Here in Colorado, this new risk rating methodology, across the state is really not going to be a dramatic change. And for about 43% of our policyholders, their rates are actually going to go down. So I don't know what it is in your community. Next slide. So on the left, you can see what our old rating variables were, was our FEMA map, that FEMA source data. And then that the flood insurance rate map, that's what you guys are gonna hopefully look at tonight for your property. And then the base flood elevation, which is how high we estimate the flood waters will rise in a high risk, in a 100-year event or a 1% chance of flooding event. Your foundation type, your structural elevation. So what's the lowest adjacent grade to your house compared to that base flood elevation? In the new rating methodology, we take our FEMA source data, the maps, and then we also add a lot of commercially available data that has been used by the private insurance industry for a number of years. Hang on a second, I'm gonna take off my dog's collar so it doesn't rattle so much. She's ready to go for a walk, guys. I'm sorry. Come here, baby. Come here. And good girl. All right, so then the rating variables here, one of the cool things that they've changed is they are taking into consideration the replacement cost value of a home. So if you are in the past, the way a $100,000 home was valued on our policy or rated was the same as if we were rating $1 million home. Now, the maximum available through the NFIP for an individual home was $250,000. But obviously a home with higher finishes or et cetera is going to hit that the higher claim amount than somebody with a $100,000 home. Their finishes are generally less expensive. So, that's taken into consideration in our rates. And then also the construction type. Is it brick? Is it a wood siding? Those kinds of things. And most importantly, how is now an elevated home with no enclosures underneath is going to be our best rate, no matter what. So, anybody who's in the audience who's considering building a new home, elevated structures are always better. And then of course, I talked about those geographic variables, the distance to the coast or the water source. Hang on a second, Harper, that's enough. And then other variables, including prior claims. And I know there was something else I wanted to talk about that was different. And I've lost my train of thought here with the dog barking in the background. And then also the types of flood perils. Is it a river? Is it a coast? And there's actually ratings for those different channels of water. So those are taken into consideration. Levees, and then the broader range of flood frequencies that you can experience. So, and then the fees and surcharges, pretty much, those stay the same. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about what's changing and what's what's staying kind of the same. I think there was a lot of concern initially when they talked about this new rating methodology, because we said the newly mapped rates were going away. Well, they're not really going away. We're just changing our language. So now we're calling that the glide path for older structures. Pre-firm means a house that was built before the flood insurance rate maps were put into place. The first map was put into place in your community and was most likely or could have been built out of compliance at the time, based on what the new flood standards are today in your community, the flood ordinances that are required for new construction. So we gave them a break. And so anybody in your community who is now going into a high-risk flood zone for the first time, you go on this glide path in which your rates don't increase more than 18% if it's a primary residence. If it's any other kind of structure, either commercial or a second home, then that rate can go up 25% a year until you reach your full actuarial risk. The rating tool actually takes in all the data, and it now has the elevation data for your structure, but it does make some pretty conservative estimates on what your next highest floor, like what the feet is between, let's say, your basement or your crawl space to the next highest floor. So sometimes an elevation certificate can be useful. If you see a change in your rates and you're wondering why, that's something you can look into. The one thing that is changing is that you used to be able, if you had a pre-firm home, you could grandfather into the prior flood map. And so in other words, if on the prior map, your older home was in a low risk flood zone and it was built with the compliance on that old map, you could grandfather. You can no longer do that. So grandfathering is going away. And those preferred risk policies are being eliminated as well. So that low risk flood zone is being rated based on that distance from the water source and all the other rating elements. And then I already talked about the replacement cost value and how we're compensating for that lower cost home, not costing as much at claim time. And so we're giving them a rate break based on that. You can still transfer any discounts that you have. So say you buy a policy because your house is going into the high risk flood zone for the first time and you're on that glide path, you can transfer that policy over to the new homeowner and keep that rate, that glide path rate in place for the new homeowner. You can't let the policy lapse for any reason. And then once the actuarial rates are reached, and that means that it's based on all of those rating factors that we talked about. And if you submit an elevation certificate yourself, that would be, and you could do that now if you think it'll help you, and that'll get you to that actuarial rate. And it might help you. And I have seen it do that it's actually cheaper than if you were on that glide path. So then you won't see that 18 to 25% annual increase. But I don't want you to think that means no increase. If they see claim losses in a particular year for a particular rating category, you may see an increase. So it doesn't mean that rate stays static. It means you won't see that 18 to 25% increase once you are rated based on your actual risk for your property. Next slide. Does somebody else want to talk about LOMAs? It's more your bailiwick.
Yeah, sure. This is Terry. So after the maps become effective, there are still ways that map changes can be made. And there have been map changes that have been made in the past, either through a letter of map revision, which physically changes the map, supported with technical data, and it physically changes either the width of the floodplain or the base flood elevation or whatever. And it ties in, typically we have those tie in when we have preliminary information to both the preliminary and effective data, so that if the maps become effective before the letter of map revision or after the letter of map revision becomes effective, we still have the preliminary data for the maps to be able to tie into the new mapping. And a lot of times if they become effective 60 days before the letter of final determination, they can be included in the final mapping products. LOMAs are based only on preliminary data. We've had some people request that, and those have to be approved through the FEMA headquarters. And if it's allowed, LOMAs can be based only on preliminary data and they may not go effective until after the preliminary maps go effective. So they can be submitted once the maps become effective, and then they'd have a waiting period after that.
And Terry, do you just want to explain what a LOMA does?
Yeah, so LOMA is a letter of map amendment. And for small areas that are, because the map scale is quite large, a lot of times an individual structure or an individual property can't be shown to be out of the floodplain. So a letter of map amendment would have information that showed that the elevation of the adjacent ground was higher than the base flood elevation or the 100-year water surface elevation if it was going to flood. And at that point, FEMA will issue a final determination that lets you know that gives the property owner that documentation to show that the property is out of the floodplain. Technically, it's above the base flood elevation, and that can be provided to a lender to show that the home is actually out of the floodplain. It won't change the map because it's such a small area. The LOMAs are usually used for a single lot or maybe a single structure or part of a lot or a couple of lots, but they're very small, and so they don't physically change the map, but you do have that document to provide to a lender in the future. Now, sometimes through this process, there are already existing letters of map revision that have been done to change the floodplain, and there are also letters of map amendments that are already effective. And FEMA will reevaluate the letters of map amendment as we go through this process towards the end and see which ones are out of both the letter of map revisions and the letter of map amendments, which ones have been incorporated into the study, which ones are still valid, and which ones may have been superseded or are no longer valid because of the new information. Maybe the floodplain got wider or the base flood elevation went up or something. And so those letters of map amendment are no longer valid. The community gets what we call a summary of map actions or a SOMA, and that will list all the letters of map revision and the letters of map amendments that we have record of in the community. So take a look at that, and it will show which ones, especially which ones might have been superseded, because it's much better for the property owner to learn that from the community than it is for them a couple of years down the road to get a letter from the lender that says that they're out. And then they may want to do a new LOMR after the stuff becomes effective. Maybe they have information that shows that they've got better information that would show that their elevation is higher. But the summary of map actions, if you take a look at that, you can see which ones have been accounted for, and sometimes there's one missing. So if you notice that there's something that's not included, please let us know, and we can get that accounted for. But anybody that's submitting a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision typically goes through the FEMA has what they call an online letter of map change portal, and that's the link that we're showing here in the slide. Next slide, please.
Can I ask
Yes,
a question?
yes, Preston.
So through this process and with the updated firms, if any supersede LOMAs, does FEMA contact individual property owners about that?
FEMA does not do outreach for those particular property owners that are superseded. So if somebody has got that, it's best for the communities to reach out, and we can help with that. We have sample letters and things like that that can be provided as well, but FEMA doesn't have that in their process. So it's not like our other property owner notification type thing, or there's no formal appeal period and that kind of thing for that. Yes, sir.
A current SOMA
Uh-huh.
would list only current LOMAs, is that correct? Or would it even pick up ones that, and I mean, if I had a LOMA, I think it was till the end of the time, but.
Right.
But that is true?
It can pick up, usually what happens is if there's a letter of map amendment, a previous letter of map amendment that was on, off of an old firm, it would have, anytime the maps get updated, like I said, FEMA reevaluates those. And they'll usually do what they call a reval letter or a reevaluation letter, and it'll be listed on that letter. So it shows that that is still valid. Okay, for the next revision. Any other questions on that? Okay. So Erin, I'll let you recap.
Yeah, so I think we covered the first bullet pretty well, but I just really like to reiterate that we are seeing an increase in claims in those low to moderate risk flood zones. So whether you're in or out isn't so important anymore because, you know, Mother Nature tends to put her water wherever she wants. And, you know, storm drains can back up and send water in directions we never anticipated and can't anticipate on our maps. You know, if you have a lot of debris, it changes that flow of water that our map modeling can't anticipate as well as we'd like. So it's important. You know, don't just look at the map and say, I'm not in a high risk flood zone, so I don't need flood insurance, because we're seeing statistically that that's just not true. And unfortunately, whenever we have a disaster, we see how underinsured, you know, we are in the state during that disaster. I think the highest percentage of insurance I've seen is in Houston, where they say 15% of people who had losses had flood insurance. Usually it's 10% or less.
Slide, please. Okay, so what can you do today? Well, after this presentation, if there are any specific mapping areas that you want to review, we can look at those. We have copies of the maps here that we can go over, and also look at any of the flood risks and how that might be changing in your area. There are no bad questions, so whatever you want to ask, please do so. Review the maps in the area, and the results show today's risk, even though the maps are just still preliminary. So it is the best available information, and even if you have effective maps, these are good for informing in areas where you don't maybe have the best information, and FEMA recommends that you kind of use the more conservative of the current mapping and the preliminary mapping when you're considering permitting issues. So ask any general questions about the National Flood Insurance Program and the mapping process. We have people from FEMA here. We also have Doug Mahan, who is our Colorado State Community Assistance Program Director, and Doug is with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. His information will be listed in at the end of this presentation as well, but he can answer any questions for you on the National Flood Insurance Program, or you can reach out to our FEMA contacts for that as well. Next slide, please. So what can you do tomorrow? Stay active in the process and ask questions. So if there are things that you're confused about or still have questions on after you've had a chance to look at things, please reach out and we can try to answer those questions or explain why things have been assumed the way they are, and protect your property. So investigate flood insurance potential with your insurance agent. Talk to the community's floodplain administrator about the upcoming 90-day appeals process in case that there's an error in the mapping or something has been shown incorrectly, that you have the option to submit an appeal for correcting that information that's shown incorrectly. It needs to be backed by scientific data, but it will be considered then as long as everything's provided. And if you're concerned and you want to talk about a appeals or comments, please reach out to the local floodplain administrator. We can also, for the local floodplain administrators, we can provide support and any questions that you might have associated with that. And then comments would be something that's not technical or doesn't change any of the technical information on the map. So maybe a label or a road name or something. So it's important to understand the flood risk because floods have and will occur. They don't stick, like Aaron was saying, they don't follow the lines on the map. They don't care. Mother Nature doesn't care where we drew anything. And we've seen a lot of those claims outside of the special flood hazard area increase over the last several years. Not much water can cause an awful lot of damage. And you can kind of see from this visual on the slide that this kind of damage is typically not covered by homeowners insurance. I know a lot of people think that they have homeowners insurance and they'll cover this, but a flood insurance coverage is an extra addition to the flood insurance policy or to your insurance policies. So make sure that you check with your real estate agent about that. I mean, your insurance agent about that. And then lenders and banks may require flood insurance anywhere. So, but like Aaron said, if you have a question about something, please reach out to them. And they may be able to help have the lender understand that actual risk to your structure. Flood insurance is available to anybody in the community that's participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. So whether they're in the floodplain or not, they have the opportunity to purchase federal flood insurance. And rates are usually cheaper for federal flood insurance and in the low and moderate areas versus the high risk areas. So next slide, please.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
Or actually make a point. So in the meeting this afternoon at the 4-H Center,
Yes.
there was a gentleman from FEMA. I don't think he's on the call, but he made an interesting point. I think he said there was 20 or so, I don't know, I'm making that up, kind of active policies in Ouray. Active policies in Ridgeway is 0.
Right.
Which was really interesting.
Yes.
I didn't know that. And so he brought it up and it was a really good point because it's been identified over the years as kind of a big deal here.
Right.
Where a lot of residences sit along Cottonwood Creek and the river. So I thought it'd be worth kind of, reiterating or highlighting that.
Yeah.
Because again, I didn't know that. And that last bullet is huge. It's available to anyone, flood insurance.
Yes, yes. And it is also, like Matt had pointed out earlier today, that the hazard mitigation plan does flag flooding as one of the highest risks for the area. So it is important to the community. And I was surprised too that there were no policies in Ridgeway.
Yeah, well, and I would just point out that if in the past, I mean, I think in a lot of cases that happens because you have a lot of people who don't have a mortgage. And in a lot of those cases, those are senior citizens who, again, can't afford a loss. I mean, I still think to this day, and that 2013 event that we had, I was out in the plains of Colorado, and I talked to a woman who was in her early 80s who lost everything on her ranch. And she had to take out a loan from the SBA to rebuild so that there was something for her family to have and take over. So much better, you recover much faster and more easily when you have flood insurance. So I know that it's a hard thing to consider, but and if our insurance seems high, then there is insurance available through the private market as well. They won't have that newly mapped advantage built into it, but sometimes they are cheaper than us, and sometimes they offer coverages that are more than us. But you have to be careful. You have to do your homework. And do your due diligence on what is covered in that policy and what isn't, and what the definition of a flood is. So,
Very good point. Thank you.
So if there are any comments or appeals, here's where they go. So basically, the public is going to submit anything to the community. They'll pass them along to us. We'll acknowledge those via email and formal written communication. And then internally, we'll go ahead and evaluate those and that'll determine a path forward. Depending on the nature of the comment, be a lot of different paths forward. So maybe we determine there's no change necessary and we resolve it that way. Maybe it's something fairly simple Like, oh, we've labeled this road Second Street, it's really First Street. We can change that pretty quickly and easily. Maybe it's something a bit more complex that requires a change to a regulatory elevation or a flood hazard boundary. If that's the case, and we go ahead and make that change, we usually resolve that with a product called a revised preliminary. That would be a new version of an app that came out that showed the new flooding. So it really depends on the nature of the comments we get, how they are resolved. But we do resolve them all one way or the other. And they will be in there. Once that happens, there'll be a formal acknowledgement sent out before we move on to final mapping. Yes, sir.
I'm a little confused, probably you've gone over this, and I just didn't catch it right at the beginning, but where are you in mapping right now locally? When was the last flood risk mapping done here?
So the one that's currently effective is from 1985.
Okay,
And the preliminary we have sitting over there was sent out February of this year. It's being developed over the past maybe 2 or 3 years.
okay. And that is the one that will be out in 90 days possibly?
No, that is the one that is gonna become effective, so it's going through the process. They'll go through, after these meetings, we'll advertise in the Federal Register, so there's a publication in that. And once that happens, that's why Mike was saying, we don't know quite what the timeline is, because it depends on when that publishes. And then there will be 2 newspaper notices in the local papers. And on the date of that second newspaper notice will be the start of the 90-day appeal period. And so then there's 90 days for somebody to submit something on that. Once all those are resolved, usually a month or so later, if everything gets resolved then the letters of final determination get issued. And at that point, like Mike said, that's when the pencils are down, and that's when those maps are going to become effective in 6 months. So it's still like a year and a half before you're going to see those maps become effective.
Okay,
Yeah, 2023, Tom.
Yeah.
2023, they'll become effective.
And probably the latter half of that.
yeah, okay.
Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So one more question.
Sure.
I'm looking, I looked at the big maps, ones that Preston has. I looked at this, and I'm interested in something larger scale, something user-friendly, something that it has got layers and has the flood map and parcels on it and subdivisions. And I'm thinking in terms of planning, and I'm thinking of people or developments that are being proposed that I question, where they are relative to the floodplain, and the things that I'm interested in, the big one, this one, and I also have some friends that I know where they live, and I'm looking here, and I couldn't tell you from this I couldn't say, you ought to buy flood insurance, because I can't see it. So does that exist and easy to get to?
Yeah, so the web map is the way to go. Now, I don't know that has parcels or subdivisions, but that's where we can punch in an address, we can zoom straight down to it, and you can get your close-in view with a color aerial background. So picture Google Maps with flood hazards on it.
Well,
And a lot of times
Okay.
we can get those, if we can get the parcel data from the community, we can include that on our map on our site as well. But the community has all the digital information and can overlay it on their parcel maps as well. But we're going to be doing that process and then providing the community a list of impacted properties as well.
okay,
So after the presentation, would one of you be willing to show Tom how to get there?
Absolutely.
I got the website pulled up now, we can take a look at whatever you like.
I love that. I have tried, I went to your site,
Mhm.
tried to get free Adobe Illustrator that it
and it didn't happen, we weren't able to do that?
I wasn't able to
Okay.
get it.
It wouldn't work on that.
What?
It wouldn't work on that.
Well, thank you, John.
Okay.
Well, I've tried it on-
Okay,
The
good to
illustrator-
know.
Illustrator doesn't run that.
And my.
Very
computer at
interesting,
home, too.
okay.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, but we'll certainly pull it up here, and if anybody has questions, we can always help with that as well,
Okay,
so.
perfect. Thank you.
That. So these are the local floodplain administrators for the community. Thank you. And that's who you'll be contacting if you have comments or appeals or just questions on the data. Like I said, the community's been provided with the information that we have, and they will be getting all of the information from these packets that we have as well. So if there are questions, and Preston is aware that we'll, CWCB or FEMA will be glad to help out in any way that we can to answer any questions as they come along. But these are the contacts. Some people don't know who their floodplain administrator is, so this is helpful. Yes?
Yeah, another spot that I'm thinking of is where East Ellis Ditch crosses County Road 5.
Okay.
Yeah, and so Cottonwood Creek is where the most flooding that I've seen since I've lived here has happened. And now it runs no water, with the exception of, I thank you for stuff you're diverting in really well of late. But if the ranchers and the people in charge of that ditch think they're going to flood, they will reach at Cottonwood Creek, and all of a sudden, depending, they might just make a small breach, to try to keep it from tearing out the road, or worse than that, going through and damaging their land. But that will cause a potential flood, because they'll open it up this far, but a couple hours of flooding,
It
it'll
won't stay,
be
yeah.
3-4 times the size and run down there. And so I'm just trying to figure out, not being, go ahead, John.
I was just gonna say, I'm looking at the ColoradoHazardMapping.com site,
Uh-huh,
and I'm seeing the detail there
yes,
of what is considered the regulatory floodway, and then there's several different A categories, A and A, E and A.
yeah. Any of the A categories are all the high-risk flood zones.
And those they show that when there's a big rain event, the Dallas ditch blows out into Cotton Creek, there's a section of Amelia Street where it can flood, thereby running south.
So that's what that's based on?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm guessing.
Yeah,
And there's
okay.
another big bulb out of Blue Lena Street, and an even bigger one kind of down below Chipeta Sun Lodge where it gets close to Blue. So
Yeah.
I think that's all taken into account.
Above
Yeah.
Liddell Street, yeah.
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 The irrigation canals, typically, because they don't have the capacity for additional flood flows, and they traverse several different watersheds and different flooding sources, they pick up water all the way along as they're going. So it's really, when we're doing these flood studies, we assume that those canals are full and not able to accept any of that water.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
so that's how those are looked at in this process. Because the ditch companies, unless you have like a special agreement, I know there are some ditch companies that will allow some of that water to be run into their systems, but you have to have an agreement, and typically they'll have some wasteway or something set up where they have controlled points where it can spill.
Gotcha.
So,
Okay.
yeah, but that's how that's been accounted for in this process. And then these are this is our contact information, and we can provide copies of this too that the community can have. But feel free to contact, like Erin said, contact her with any questions. She has a counterpart, Diana Herrera, who also is with FEMA, a FEMA insurance specialist, and they can answer any questions specific to like an individual property or specific situation. They're very helpful with that. And if you have any technical questions, we can answer that, or CDM Smith will help with that. If you have questions on the National Flood Insurance Program, like we said, the FEMA people or Doug Mahan with our office is available to answer any of those questions. So that's kind of who to call when. And regardless of if you call any of us, we'll make sure you get to the right person. So just to let you know that. And then we just had some short slides at the end that to remember that if the flood touches your property's land, but not your home is actually not in the floodplain. And Erin, you had something to say about this as well in the last presentation.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, this is one of the areas, do you want to go back to that slide? Yeah. So, on the left where you see the roof line in blue, you're clearly in. On the right, you see some buildings where the parcel is in, but the structure is out. And the lender, you may still get a note from your lender saying that you're in, even though your structure is out. And I got to tell you, that far upper left photo where the building is that close to that blue line, they're probably gonna need an elevation certificate to get removed. But the other ones in there, we might be able to work with the lender to remove the requirement for flood insurance because the building is out. But if you have these questions, if the lender sends you a letter saying that you're now in a high-risk flood zone, give us a call. Any of us here, I can help. Anybody else can help as well. But I'm more than happy to help work with your lender and help resolve this. So.
Okay, and then the next slide, this is just some things to keep in mind to prepare when there's a flood coming, to move your valuables and important documents to a safe place. Any utilities, if they can be a foot above the projected flood elevation for protection, that is great. Anchor any fuel tanks and have battery operated backup for your systems. Clear debris from the gutters and downspouts around your property so that the water can move away from that. Then other things to do are create a safety kit, post emergency numbers and teach your children how to dial 911, and learn and practice flood evacuation routes. I'm sure the community probably has a system with that with their emergency management, and figure out how to get to high ground with your family from home or work or school. So if there are any additional questions, does anybody have anything to add, FEMA, or anybody on the line that has specific questions? Do you guys have any questions here? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. And we'll be providing the presentation as well as additional documents to the community. We do have some hard copy maps here, like Tom, that you've already looked at. And please reach out if there's a question or you have additional questions. Like Marta always says, there are no dumb questions. You just need to ask us whatever you need to know. So appreciate your time and hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.
I'll check out the map.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming out.
Thank you all.